We bought rope, we bought these sleeves, we implemented them, and we cut the vertical lines every 40 feet. We inserted a sleeve. Why would you do that? Well, a couple of reasons. One of which is that, from what I'm told by these researchers, a male right whale is 45 feet long. A female right whale is 40 feet long. The girth of a right whale is 38 feet long. As Amy has pointed out, a high entanglement is when you have trailing line. A moderate or low entanglement is when you don't. So we insert this every 40 feet. It breaks at 1,700 pounds or less. So it's a wonderful thing.
Good evening, folks. Welcome to the New England Aquarium Lecture Series. So the focus of this evening is on a conflict almost as old as humans have existed. And it's a persistent theme in nature conservation. It's about what happens when, in pursuit of our livelihood as a species, we sacrifice nature, or at least certain bits of it that stand in our way. The story could be told again and again from all corners of the world, on land and in sea, and throughout the centuries. The theme of the talks this evening, followed by a panel discussion, is about a conflict involving the North Atlantic right whale and the fishing gear that entangles it. For many, New England conjures up images of a rich maritime history, of whaling, of fishing. Our heritage dates back centuries, beginning with the arrival of the Basques in northwestern Atlantic waters maybe 400 years ago, when hunting emerged as the main threat to whales worldwide. Today, some hunting continues by a few nations and Aboriginal communities, and even though a handful of countries still engage in whaling, the threat has been replaced by unintentional entanglement in fishing ropes and nets. The many buoys that dot the surface along much of the coastal waters of New England belie the hazardous world to whales and leatherback sea turtles from ropes that extend down to the seafloor. These ropes are used to mark the presence of fishing gear, mostly lobster pots, and to secure a line at the surface that fishermen use to haul up their catch. Interactions with whales and ropes often result in the whales becoming entangled. As you can see, this is an animation trying to give you a sense of what's happening underwater, how crowded the marine environment really is when you get a lot of dense fishing ropes and the sorts of obstacles as a large animal that you have to navigate going through them. So the problem is that the encounter causes pain and suffering for the animals, many of whom drown or slowly perish from ropes that constrict how they swim, how they eat, even how they reproduce. Fishermen suffer too. First, it's not that they want to entangle whales. And when these entanglements occur, fishermen face increased scrutiny from the public and from government regulators to curtail how they fish. So, although fishing gear entangles all species of whales around the world in all types of fishing gear, in this region it's the North Atlantic right whale that captures the most attention because it's the most endangered marine mammal in the North Atlantic. So it's a species largely restricted to the Northwest Atlantic, Florida north to the Canadian Maritimes. Population estimate is now that there are fewer than 440 individuals, and only 105 of those are breeding females. Since 2010, calving rates have gone down 44%. We actually didn't see any mom-calf pairs during the winter season, which is rarely happens. And, of course, very alarming is that the incidence and severity of North Atlantic right whale entanglements have gone up since the mid-1990s and now surpass ship strikes as the main threat. So contrast this against the fishery. We have a lobster fishery that commercially operates from Long Island north to Newfoundland. It's a high-value fishery. For example, in Maine, generates $670 million in revenues, but then if you look across the entire supply chain, the value is much higher. There's an estimated 6,000 lobster fishermen in the state of Maine. Of course, not all are active, and they operate 3 million individual traps, but also not all fished at once or fished at all. Massachusetts, 1,400 commercial permit holders with about 380,000 traps. And I want to point out that it's not just lobster fishing. There are other fisheries that use this gear or similar gear, including Jonah crab, hagfish, and gill nets to entangle whales. And this doesn't include a lot of the recreational fishing gear that's also in the water. So, kind of doom and gloom, but there is some good news. We believe that there are ways to fish that reduce and even eliminate entanglements, and we're going to talk about mainly, at least in part, the first one, whale release rope, touch a little bit on ropeless fishing, which involves taking ropes completely out of the water column altogether and fishing in a different way. It's an active area of research that we have ongoing here at the aquarium, and you can see more information on that if you go to our website, which is bycatch.org. Kristen Porter, in addition to fishing for lobster and scallops and sometimes networking with fellow lobstermen across the globe, serves as president of the Maine Lobstermen's Association, a group that's one of the founding members of our Bycatch Consortium here at the New England Aquarium. And he's a leading voice for the industry, including on the issue of whale entanglements, and our first speaker.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. As Tim said, my name is Kristen Porter. I am a lobster fisherman out of Cutler, Maine. Let's see. And since March 1st, been president of the Maine Lobstermen's Association, which has been around for 64 years. I'm going to skim through a lot of this. Tim said I've got way too many slides, so a lot of this I'm going to skim through, and I'll be happy to answer questions later on. So that's Cutler, Maine, way up in almost to Canada. Picture of the harbor. We have some humongous tides in that area. That's my dock, and it drops about 16 to 18 feet in 6 hours and comes back again. So so all that water has to come in and out of the Bay of Fundy. So there's quite a lot of tide up in there. This is my fishing vessel. The gear we use, basically your standard lobster trap. We do use a lot of rope and buoys on the surface. As Tim said, lobster landing's pretty big in the state of Maine, pretty big to the economy of the state of Maine. 7 zones, each zones are regulated. We have some overarching regulations that everybody adheres to, but we also can use stricter regulations per zone if the zone wishes. MLA had participated in the process with research from whales since 97. The whale plan. This is where we started. The scope of the whales runs from Maine to Florida, and I don't know if you guys have seen a lot in the news lately about how big and wonderful and everything Canada is for all they're doing for whales this year. Well, that is the scope, of their management, right there. And this is us. So U.S. fisheries. All fixed gear fisheries have to have gear markings. No floating rope at the surface. All ground lines, which are lines between traps or pots, has to be sinking rope. We have to have weak links of 600 pounds on our buoys. In case a whale interacts with them, they break off. We had vertical line reduction rules in 2014, and some areas of the coast have rope strength. Some of the southern states have rope strengths of 2,000-pound breaking strength. Canada, up until last year, had basically nothing. But they do have the crab and lobster in Prince Edward Island area, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence area. They have to have gear marking this year. No floating around at the surface. They have dynamic area management closures, which I'll get back to in a minute, but which have just, some of them have been kicked in. They have to have a report if they lose gear, and they have fishing seasons and they've reduced their trap limits this year. So another thing, little thing that the area I fish is an area called the gray zone, which is a disputed area. I hear some laughing going on over here. That I fish alongside of Canadians in that area. So, well, yeah. So I fish there with my rules. They fish there with their rules, which is basically nothing. So I have floating line at slack tide, because when all that water comes in and before it goes back out, the tide turns the other way. It kind of stops for about an hour. And there's floating line, miles of it, you will attest to, that is all over the top of the surface. And so we're both working in there with our own management, but it's frustrating from a fisherman's standpoint, to say. So as far as what we're doing as far as closures, and this is a stickling point for some of those, and you'll hear later on this one here, we have some huge closures in the U.S. for right whales, basically adding up to 30,000 square miles. And 32,000 square miles. Canada has 3,600 square miles. And some of these are dynamic area management. So they're not closed until there are a certain amount of whales sighted in that area, and then you have to take your gear out of that area. So everybody goes out, and they take the gear out of that area, and by the time they get the gear out of the area, the whales are gone to another area. So those are the area you just put it in. So you're playing musical chairs with your gear, and we had those dynamic area management in the 90s, late 90s, and decided they weren't all that effective. So some of the challenges that we've had sinking ground lines is that they catch things on bottom. It's a huge safety issue, but we've learned to deal with it. It's a huge cost because it chafes on bottom, so our replacement costs are about double or more than double what they were, because it lasts less, not as long, and it's twice as expensive. But we are in compliance. We've been in compliance. We've been checked. Maine Department of Marine Resources did a survey 2009-2010, checked 243 fishermen, 93% compliance. And then in fiscal year 2015, Office of Law Enforcement of NOAA did a lot of checking and found that we were mostly compliant. And most of the non-compliance was not whale related. It was more improperly marked gear and things like that. So Maine's lobster industry's effort to protect light whales, started in '97, and I don't want to go all through these, but the weak links, we had tracers on all of our gear to indicate if a whale is entangled that it was ours, and dynamic area management that we did away with by going to sinking ground lines. And since we've gone to sinking ground lines, not one piece of sinking ground line has been found on any whale. So lobster gear and entanglements, just wanted to show that Maine Lobstermen's Association, our staff, got all the whale entanglement data from National Marine Fisheries Service and pawed through and went through every case that was marked Maine lobster gear or lobster pot gear. So there are some like U.S. lobster offshore. These are entanglements. One from 2000 to 2004, none to the present. These ones in the parentheses are deaths. So one U.S. lobster, unknown, one death between 2000 and 2004. And Canadian snow crab gear between 2000 in 15, so in basically 2 years, had 12 entanglements and 5 deaths. So, and that, I think, from a fisherman's standpoint, that's what's stirred everything back up again, is those deaths. And our Endangered Species Act and Marine Mammal Protection Act is very strict. Canadians, not so much. But it's a work in progress, for sure. But we are an easy target. So just some graphs on mortalities and entanglements. So we've done a lot of collaborative research since the 90s with the Bycatch Consortium, which is basically the aquarium, and done, I've tested a lot of different ropes and different breakaways, pictures of some of that, different ropes and time tension cutters. Did a report on how our gear is fished, and somebody else will go into that in a little bit. But so we've also, one of the unintended consequences of sinking ground lines is it catches on bottom and there's a lot of gear on bottom lost. So we actually have derelict gear days, and go out and try to grapple back and try to get some of that gear back and take care of it. Go into a little bit of what some of the topic tonight on just on ropeless fishing. I know one of the other presentations will be more on some of the weaker ropes and breakaway ropes. Under the kindness of Tim, I accompanied him to Australia and saw one of the only guys in the world that's doing ropeless fishing on a commercial scale. And I mean, he's making it work, but he's the only guy. He's one guy in his whole area that's making it work, and he long soaks, single pots. And so, yes, it's a interesting technology, but all technologies don't work in all fisheries. So it's a huge hurdle for not just the Maine lobster fishery, but any pot fishery in the U.S. because they're in an individual transferable quota system. So he has no competition. So he doesn't have when I talk to him about his competition, it's how many miles drive by car to the next fisherman. So that's he doesn't have to worry about somebody setting over the top of him or him setting on the top of somebody else. The Maine Department of Marine Resources, Maine Lobstermen Association, and the University of Maine has just received a grant to do some work on our ropes, on our end lines, vertical lines, to just a baseline of where we are, where they break at, what is everybody using. So we get a baseline, so when we talk about future regulations, we know where our starting point is. And we stay engaged. We've had 8 industry meetings up and down the coast of Maine just to talk about whale entanglements and how they can be prevented and what rules down the road we can and can't live with. And looking ahead, some of the steps that we're taking now and some of the research that needs to be done to address the issues for right whales and entanglements. So I'll get done. Tim told me I couldn't do it in 10 minutes, but spent 10 minutes and 55 seconds. So.
So I'm just looking, your answering service wants to pass along a message. Your application for dual citizenship to Canada has been declined.
Did you sense bias? I was trying to be as fair as I could.
Our next speaker is Amy Knowlton, who's a research scientist at the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life here at the aquarium, who's been studying right whales for several decades.
Don't tell.
Amy's going to talk about our work on what we call whale release rope, including research that provided critical scientific justification for this fishing strategy.
Yeah, I'll go here. Great, thanks, Tim. Thanks for being here tonight. And what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to provide you an overview about what we know about the right whale entanglement crisis. And here at the Anderson Cabot Center, there's a whole team of us that are working on understanding the entanglements, and we curate the photo identification catalog which helps inform the issue. So as part of this curation effort, we, well, first I want to just say I'm going to talk about monitoring the frequency and severity of entanglements, what we've learned from the fishing gear that has been entangling whales, and what options for mitigation are available. As part of this curation effort, we keep careful track of the entanglement interactions using two main approaches. First is the scar coding effort, where we look at every photograph sighting of an individual right whale and determine if there's evidence of entanglement from wrapping scars, typically found on the tail region, but also other parts of the body. And recently, we've been categorizing these scars according to the severity, minor, moderate, and severe. The other thing we look at is for those subset of whales that have attached gear, we look at the entanglement configuration risk. A low-risk entanglement is one where there's only one anchoring point, no constricting wraps, and very little trailing gear, usually less than a body length. And typically that gear is shed. Whereas in high-risk entanglements have multiple anchoring points or constricting wraps or trailing gear greater than a body length or a combination of any of those parameters. So here's just an example of a low-risk entanglement. This whale eventually shed the gear within weeks of being first detected with it. Whereas this is a high-risk entanglement where this whale was seen on one day with rope tightly embedded in his upper jaw. He was never seen again. So we know that whale died. He was in very poor condition. So what we've learned from the scar coding project is that right whales are entangled frequently. We've documented nearly 1,400 unique interactions based on scars from 1980 through 2015. And 113 of those have attached gear. So you can see that the scarring is a big part of our understanding of how frequently these events are happening. So this involves 85% of the population, 614 individuals. 94 of those individuals have been entangled 4 or more times, as many as 7 times. So it's a very chronic problem for these animals. But even more disturbing is that we're seeing a higher rate of moderate and severe injuries, especially in the past decade. And we know that these severe and moderate injuries can lead to health impacts and have reduced reproduction in the few breeding females that are left in this species. What we also know is that when we looked at this entanglement configuration risk by year, you can see that not only have we had an escalation in the number of entanglements occurring, back in the 1980s when I first started in this project, we only had 7 whales seen with attached gear. This jumped up in the 90s to 22 whales, and then it's doubled in the 2000s and 2010s to over 40 individuals with attached gear. But also, nearly all of those entanglements are now what we call high configuration risk. And we believe those entanglements, we know many of those entanglements are going to be lethal, especially if they're not disentangled. So this is a significant increase, and it's a much greater increase than just the population increase that we were seeing up till 2010. So we started to ask ourselves what could explain these temporal changes that we're documenting in both the increasing severity of scars and the higher risk configuration entanglements. So we started looking at rope manufacturing changes. And what we learned is that, prior to the 1950s, before plastics were developed, everybody was using natural fiber ropes. And if you look at the 3/8 inch diameter rope on the left side of that graph, the breaking strength for natural fibers was about just over 1,000 pound breaking strength. Then starting in the 1950s, when plastics were developed, they started using polypropylene ropes. And that doubled the breaking strength to just over 2,000 pounds. But what was really interesting was that they developed a new manufacturing approach in the mid-1990s called co-extrusion, where they were able to blend different plastic resins together and develop what's called copolymer rope. And this doubled the breaking strength again to over 4,000 pounds. And you can see as the diameter goes up, that it goes up exponentially, that breaking strength. So this to us could be a really important aspect of the problem. So we wanted to delve into this further and start exploring what we could learn from the ropes that were found on entangled whales, both from during disentanglement or carcasses. So we have a paper that we published in 2016 on this work, which is available open access in conservation biology if you're interested in reading it. But it was a really interesting study because we were able to team up with a rope engineer, and with his help, we looked at the polymer type, the diameter, and the breaking strength of the given ropes found on these entangled whales. We looked at 70 cases, which involved 4 different species, minke, right, humpback, and fin whales. And we learned 2 interesting patterns from that study. First is that minke whales, being the smallest of the baleen whales, smallest of these 4 species, were found in significantly lower breaking strength ropes than the other 3 species. What we also learned with right whales, when we looked at right whales by age, because we have a very detailed catalog on individuals, we found that right whales from 0 to 2 years old were in significantly lower rope strength than the adults. And the big concern about this finding is that we believe that juveniles, these young whales or minke whales, if they were to get entangled in the stronger ropes, they would probably drown in situ and not be detected. So it's a big concern that we're impacting all the entire age range, but these young animals are probably being impacted even more than we've been able to document. So as a result of this study, we determined that rope strengths of 1,700 pounds, if they were employed in the fishing industry, could dramatically reduce the incidence of these moderate and severe injuries and high risk configuration risk entanglements. And that's what we recommended in our paper. So here's just a concept of how a whale release rope would work. A whale would hit the rope. It would ideally swim fast, hard against that rope and get to that 1,700-pound force quite quickly and break it without starting to thrash around and get wrapped up and result in the complex entanglements that we have been documenting more frequently. And there might be an unintended good benefit for the fishermen in that maybe their gear sets would not be dragged away by a whale who gets entangled in that gear. So maybe it will help reduce the gear loss that fishermen we know experience quite a lot. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about disentanglement, because there are a lot of efforts to disentangle large whales here in the US and in Canada. We feel that it's an important tool, but it's not a solution to this issue. And I just wanted to talk about an experience I had. This was back in 2002 when I was involved in a disentanglement effort, and I was working with my colleague, Chris Lay, and we approached this whale. The only tool we had in hand that could help this situation was a cutting hook, which had the inside of that hook was a knife, a sharp knife. So you'd have to get it under the rope, pull, and it would cut that rope off. We had a perfect approach. We put that hook on that rope, but unfortunately, because it was so tightly bound around its head, it couldn't get underneath the rope. And so it was not successful. 3 years later, we saw that whale, and that rope was so deeply embedded into its head, it wasn't even visible. And that whale then disappeared. So it's just to say that disentanglement is a tool, but it's not going to succeed in disentangling every entangled whale that is documented out there. It's a lot of logistics to get out there and make that happen. So what's next? The whale release rope work is well underway. We've been working with the South Shore Lobster Fishermen's Association folks, a few of which are here, and John will be speaking next about this work. But they've been doing some pilot testing of whale release ropes in lobster gear off Massachusetts to see how it works for them. We're going to continue with the development and testing of whale release ropes with other fisheries, including in Canada. That's our hope anyway. We also have a project underway, which is to evaluate what rope strength fishermen need to effectively haul their gear. We don't want whale release ropes to cause more gear loss because they're losing it every time they bring their gear to the surface. But as Kristan noted, I think fishermen can adapt to what is required, and if 1,700-pound ropes were required, I think they could figure out ways to make it work for them. Also, U.S. and Canadian governments are exploring regulatory measures, or expanded regulatory measures, which may integrate a whale release rope solution into those measures. So the work is underway. We have our pilot study, which should be done by the end of this summer. And our hope is that this is one tool that can help address this very chronic problem for right whales. Thanks.
So we will have an opportunity for questions with the panel after 2 more talks. Our next speaker is John Haviland, who he's a lobster fisherman out of Scituate. What more do I have to say?
Please, Tim. You're only half. Thank you very much. My name is, in fact, John Haviland. Timmy was correct on that, but I fish out of a small port called Green Harbor in the town of Marshfield. So that's that. But we don't need to talk about Timmy. Well, let me talk about Timmy. First of all, he called me about 2 months ago to try and do this presentation, which I vehemently declined. I said, I've had enough of trying to make these discussions and have things work. But then again, he says in his whiny little voice, but it's not till June 19th. I go, hey, a lot of shit can happen between now and June 19th, so I might say yes. And then the best caveat was that he said, well, you'll be in front of all friends. They're all going to be friends there listening to what you have to say. I said, whoa, man, he just hooked me hook, line, and sinker, right? So he does lie. But look, there's my friend up there in the corner. So when he says I'm going to be here in front of all my friends, the first thing that popped into my mind was what I tell all my friends, which I'll tell you. I have an addiction. I said it. I have an addiction. For 43 years, I've been addicted to lobster fishing. So, what does that mean? You know, it doesn't mean shit. It doesn't mean anything to a lot of people, but it does if you do in fact have an addiction. You start to get, twitches, and you see people up in the corner. Although they did wave back, so I'm appreciative of that. So now that I have this addiction, what does that mean? It means that the area to which I fish, which is in Green Harbor, is in one of those charts that was shown by Kristan. It's 3,043 square nautical miles. So that creates a problem because it's closed for 3 months. And when this was coming down, which was basically 4 years ago, the association that I represent, which is called the South Shore Lobster Fishermen's Association, we have a few members here, had to handle this straight on. Got an addiction. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? So we said, well, let's try to come up with some type of thought process, which we did. But I'll get to the research and then Amy's wonderful discussion, which he just said. But having to deal with this over the 4 or 5 years, I got to meet some wonderful people, Amy being one, and my ex-friend Tim another, and Scott Krause that's here as well. And, they've taught me a lot because they're researchers, and they know stuff. I'm a Port Bernard's commercial fisherman. So I said, now that I got an addiction, and I'm closed from lobster fishing due to the fact that I may entangle a right whale, I said, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to be one of the big boys. So I did this survey. Now, there's a plus or minus error here involved, and I don't know all that stuff. But my survey was as follows. I went up to 10 people, various people, and I asked them, I said, what do you call a lobsterman that can't lobster? Well, some people looked at me inquisitively and said, are you for real? I go, yeah. I had an addiction. What do you call a lobsterman that can't lobster? The number one answer from the people, well, the number one most response was unemployed. Well, that's appropriate, right? We're unemployed. Can't go lobstering. Second answer that I got, what do you call a lobsterman that can't lobster? Well, one person said, a whale watcher. Now, that was a good answer as well. Why? Because for 4 years, I know more stuff about whales than I've ever known and I ever want to know. So that's an appropriate answer as well. The third answer was, what do you call a lobsterman that can't lobster? And the answer was, well, they're just a boat owner. Well, again, that's true. So I said, well, I'm going to put my head down. I'm going to, really think about this. So I have 4 months off from fishing, and I'm going to think about this. I think about it, and I go, what do you call a lobsterman that can't lobster? Epiphany. I go, I know what you call it. You call it a problem solver. A lobsterman that can't lobster is going to be a problem solver. Oh, okay. So what do? We go and we start solving problems, Amy Knowlton being one of them. There was a couple of charts up here where they had the horizontal and vertical, where she was talking about the rope strength and the entanglements. And you can see the rope strength on the horizontal, and I think the verticals were on, well, whatever, I don't know that stuff. But at any rate, it was a graph, right? I'm just a poor but honest lobsterman. So you look at her chart, and what she did, and what sticks out to everybody is, you look down to the chart, and down on that bottom left, there's like a void there. You go, what up about that? Well, I call that the window of opportunity. What does that mean? No whales, right whales are getting caught, and there was a minimum amount of strength of line, 2,000 pounds or under. So you go, yeah, shit, let's get there. I won't. In front of my friends. So how do you get there? Well, it's going to be hard. You know why it's going to be hard? Because the vertical lines that we use in my harbor, because I'm only thinking about this 3,043 square nautical miles that are closed, historically use a 3/8 vertical line with a breaking strength out of the box approximately 3,400, 3,800 pounds. Now, that's nowhere near 1,700 pounds, is it? No, it's not. So what do? Well, let's see how we can do this without incurring many costs. Because being a lobsterman for 43 years, you don't know what your income's going to be. Every day is a good day, but you don't know if every year is going to be a good year. So what I personally did, and try to be a problem solver, was simplistically was, well, I don't have a PowerPoint project other than that. So what I do have is a little plastic device here that you would tie your line in where my finger is. And if you can see right here, there's an indentation. And that indentation scientifically will break at 1,600 pounds. All right, so let's do this right off the bat to see, so no one's buying any rope, no one's wasting any time, and life's going to go on. So I did that. Put that on a handful of traps. I hauled it as high as I could. No one got hurt. Nothing broke. Everything was wonderful. Well, that's pretty cool. I guess it's functionally can happen, right? Well, how else are we going to implement this? Well, the next thing I did, being a poor but honest commercial fisherman, I went to a supply store, a marine supply store that we have in our area in Brant Rock. They're on my next PowerPoint. It had some old stuff in the back of their shop in their warehouse, and it's this threaded tube. All right. Now you go, what up about this? Well, what we do is we use this under the idea of a Chinese finger. Those finger toys. I don't know if anybody knows that. But when I was 10 years old, right, put my finger on one side, I put my finger on the other side. And I started to cry. So like that flashed back, right? I said, oh, that's pretty cool. So let's try that. So now this company was kind enough to allow us to take a couple spools of this stuff, and we decided to try and use it under the aspect of a finger toy. Cut out a vertical line, thread this through it. Now here's the vertical line here, and this will break. This line here would then break at, we had it tested, and I think it was 1,475 pounds, a lot lower than we wanted, but all we're doing is trying to get the application to see if the application would work. So we tested that for a year or two, and it worked. But there was a number of things wrong with this, and that was that it wasn't engineered correctly to our lines. The inside diameter was well over 3/8, so that technology or engineering of it actually sticking wasn't working as well. So then we said, well, we got to move on. We got to solve this problem. I'm addicted. So what did we do? Well, we chased down the governor of the Massachusetts, a guy named Charlie Baker. And then you see, in the paper, on the news, he's going to be somewhere. Well, we became in that same spot at the same time. I said, Governor, we got a problem. Very friendly guy. What's the problem? And I went on and told him what's going on. Well, you're going to solve it, right? I go, yeah, I'm going to solve this, but I need some money. Well, what do you need? Well, I'm new to this game, and I didn't know about grants like these guys know about grants. So I said, I don't know. Got a piece of paper, and I figured some stuff out, and came up with 18 grand. Oh, he goes, I know. He goes, we got people. Go to the Matt Beaton. He's the Secretary of Environment in the state of Massachusetts. All right, we'll set up a meeting. We go to Matt Beaton. Wonderful guy as well. We tell him our problem, how we're going to solve it. He says, maybe we can find you some funding from the Massachusetts Environmental Trust. And the Massachusetts Environmental Trust is, as you probably have seen, the whale plates in the state of Massachusetts, as well as there's a brook trout plate for Western Mass and a covered bridge. And the funding from that goes into the Massachusetts Environmental Trust, which funds these things. Okay, we're stepping up. All you got to do is fill out this application and deadlines and paperwork. Fortunately, we had a woman that was a go-getter, because I wasn't, and we got a grant. So here we go. Let me move on. So we got $18,000, and we said, well, let's do this. Let's try to do this right. So we got the company that did the first sleeve, and we had one actually manufactured to what we wanted to do. And that was a smaller diameter. It would have more engineering sticking points to it. And we bought rope, we bought these sleeves, we implemented them, and we cut the vertical lines every 40 feet. We inserted a sleeve. Why would you do that? Well, a couple of reasons. One of which is that, from what I'm told by these researchers, a male right whale is 45 feet long. A female right whale is 40 feet long. The girth of a right whale is 38 feet long. As Amy has pointed out, a high entanglement is when you have trailing line. A moderate or low entanglement is when you don't. So we insert this every 40 feet. It breaks at 1,700 pounds or less. So it's a wonderful thing. So this is going to be great. Right? I just lost it. So we tried to get it implemented with the take reduction team, and I don't want to say any bad things about them other than Kristen was really shitting on Canada, but that's okay. but I won't do that. So we presented that a year ago. Problem is, it got turned down. It was an interesting question. So that, oh no, I like that. Hey, don't worry. So that got turned down. So now what do we have? We have modified vertical lines, and we weren't allowed to use them. Now, where does that leave you? It brings me back to this thought. I see this little verse that you might see in an antique shop or something. It's on a placket, and they say various things, you know. If you're near the beach or something, it's a wonderful day or something like that. But this one said, a goal without a plan is just a wish. I go, what? Wait a second. A lobsterman that can't lobster is a problem solver. But if you can't implement the plan, what are you? You're a lobsterman that can't lobster, so you're unemployed. You're a boat owner, but you're not a problem solver. So, I guess research has to continue, or we have to demand that some of these things get implemented. I don't know if that's been 10 minutes, but I'm out of breath. Thank you.
So, for anybody that's worried, he is safe. You can hang out in the lobby with him afterwards, I guarantee it. Our last speaker is Laurens Howle. He's a professor of mechanical engineering and material science at Duke University. Duke, which is another founding member of our Bycatch consortium here at the aquarium. He also runs his own consulting company called Belquan Engineering. His expertise spans a range of engineering topics. What we got him involved in is what he's going to talk about tonight, which is a new way to kind of test some of these ideas like what John just presented on using computer modeling.
Thank you. All right, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me up to speak. And I have to tell you that Tim originally got me involved in this topic maybe, 10 years ago or so. So if you like what I'm going to say, he gets the credit. If you don't like what I'm about to say, he gets the blame. All right, so let's see if we're on. All right, so I also need to acknowledge my collaborator, Doug Nowacek, who's at the Duke University Marine Laboratory. And he and I have been working on this for however many years it's been now. So collaborators, we have strong collaboration with the folks here at the New England Aquarium, Scott Krause, Tim Warner, Patrice McCarran, who is the executive director of the Maine Lobstermen's Association, has also been extremely helpful, and we've worked with her quite a bit. And this work, I need to acknowledge, has been funded by NOAA under a couple of grants from the Marine Fisheries Services. So what we wanted to do was to build a computer simulation or program that we can use to, first of all, see if we can understand how whales become entangled. There are very few observations of a whale interacting with gear as it becomes entangled, but we have plenty of photographs of whales that are wrapped up in gear, and we wanted to try to figure out to see if we can find out how that happened. And that's what we're calling reverse engineering of these entanglements from the field observations. Also, we wanted to be able to generate some videos, so for community outreach and education and so forth. And we wanted to test various gear configurations, and that's a more recent portion of this project that I'll get to in a few minutes. So not being a fisherman, I don't know anything about lobster gear. So I went to Patrice and asked her about this, and she put together this very helpful booklet that tells us about various gear configurations. For example, inshore, and I'll simulate some inshore gear with the computer program I'll show you here in a few minutes. These typically have a vertical line that you've heard about, and there's a surface marker buoy. Let me turn this on so I can use the laser pointer here. So surface marker buoy, vertical line, usually there's a sink portion, a float portion, ground lines and gangins that connect a few traps up to this ground line. And these might or might not have various weights. And right now with our computer program, we're really restricted to this inshore type of gear configuration because the offshore gear configuration is considerably heavier, and we're not yet to the point where we can simulate these configurations. All right, so back to the other mic. So these are the areas on the whale where they typically become entangled, either near the mouth, up here, and you've seen a couple of photographs of that, or there are entanglements involving the flipper, and typically when they're involving the flipper, they also involve the body. They're wrapped around the body several times. They can also wrap around the flipper many times, and to the point where that rope can cut into the flipper, and actually the bone will grow around that rope. And another place they become entangled is here at the peduncle. Oops, wrong button. All right, you've seen all my talk now, so I can stop. All right, so at the caudal peduncle right there is another place where they become entangled, and we're not yet to the point where we can test the entanglements involving the mouth. So the couple of cases I'll show you involve the flipper and also the tailstock. All right, so here's an actual case study of an entanglement, and we have a booklet of these case studies that have a depiction of the gear as it is first seen on the whale, and also that gear, if it's recovered, we know what gear went into that. The lines, the sizes, the lengths, the floats, and so forth. We have that information. This particular whale was a female, born in 2001. And you heard Amy talk about the catalog, so we know quite a bit about these whales. Well, I don't, she does. And it was entangled between 57 and 266 days, and we know that because of the bounds of when we first see this entangled and when it becomes disentangled. This was disentangled on this date, and it was sighted dead just a short while after that. And this particular whale had one prior entanglement, so this was the second time it became entangled. So what we wanted to do is to try to figure out how the gear can interact with this tailstock here and possibly become entangled. And so I'll show you a bit of an animation of how we do that. And I don't know why there's sound here. That's machine noise. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the water. And because I'm a computer nerd, I'd much rather sit in front of a computer and program this than go out into the field and actually get dirty. So what you're going to see here is that the whale first detects the gear and then reacts or startles to that and tries to avoid it. It might become originally entangled or at least contact up near the front flipper, but then it could possibly shed that gear in the forward part of the whale, and then it would move down the body and become entangled in the tailstock. So in putting this program together, we have several things we can do. We can first of all program the behavior and see what happens, or even more useful than that, we can use a game controller, and one of our fisheries scientists, or my son who's very good at video games, by the way, this is the first thing I've ever done that he thought was cool, can sit there with the controller and try to entangle the whale so we can try to understand what happens. And here you've seen it shed the gear from the flipper region, and it now has traveled back along the tailstock. And from that point on, if the whale does any rolling behavior, it's just going to wind that gear up, and there's little chance after that that it's going to become disentangled. Also, as it winds that gear up, it can cut very deeply into the tailstock, and one of the pictures that Amy showed actually has gear cut deeply into the tailstock. All right, so that's one type of entanglement, and here's another case study, also a female, entangled between 9 and 296 days. It was disentangled and last sighted on that date, and I don't know, this is rather old, I don't know if this particular whale has been sighted again since then. So we wanted to try to study how flippers interact with the body and the rope to become entangled with that type. And let's see if I can get this one to play. All right, good, no sound for this one. All right, so the whale is going to swim toward the rope, and they might not actually see it until they're fairly close to it. And at some point they're going to react and maybe startle and move to avoid it. And unfortunately, when they do a quick maneuver, they sweep their flippers forward, and that's the worst possible way it can be in order for entanglement to occur. But of course, nothing can be done about that. And if it begins to roll, what's going to happen is it starts to wrap that rope around the body. And so at that point, you have a lot of friction between that rope that's wrapped around the body and the body of the whale itself. And at some point, that rope is going to stop sliding along that body, and it's going to stay there and become wrapped up, and then begin to trail behind as this evolves into a more serious entanglement. All right, and so as I mentioned, one of the first objectives of this project was to try to understand how some of these entanglements occur. And after doing that and using this program for a while, we thought there might be another useful tool that we can use this for, another useful study, and that is to test various gear configurations. So you heard Amy talk about weak ropes, and John talk about the breakaway, the weak links. And so what we're working on now is to try to test various gear configurations that might either use weak ropes or weak links. And we want to do this to try to understand if they're going to help before mandated change in gear configuration might come down. Right? It's very expensive and time consuming to change gear according to regulations, as I'm sure these gentlemen can attest. So we want to try to have an idea if it's going to work before something comes down. So let me show you this final configuration. And here we just have a two-trap, two-brick trawl with the same sink rope, floating rope configuration. The whale is going to interact with that. And I've set the breaking strength of this rope to be fairly low. It's below the 1,700 pounds that Amy talked about. We can't quite reach that level, so we're working on the program to get that to work out. So here you see it's rolling. It's wrapping that gear around its body. And here, those are the two traps. It's going to pick up the first one and start carrying that along. But then when the tension takes up along the ground line, and that starts dragging along the bottom with the friction that comes up, at some point the rope is going to break, and it has broken at this point. It's a little bit difficult to see. So it could shed the gear below, and then if the whale is lucky, the gear that was above with the float on it would also shed from that whale. And so possibly that could lead, or that gear configuration could lead to a case where that entanglement does not become a lasting entanglement that might endanger the whale. All right, we've already done that. All right, so let me wrap this up, and I'm going to be right within 10 seconds of when you want me to wrap up. So we're currently generating some entanglement scenarios just by going over and over again with the different behaviors to try to see how these things either turn into a lasting entanglement or they become disentangled quickly. We're looking at the energetic cost of becoming entangled. So if a whale is entangled and has to swim around towing this extra gear for 6 months or a year, it really puts a big tax on the metabolics of that whale. And as I mentioned, we're studying various gear configurations to try to see if they might be useful in solving the entanglement problem. So acknowledgments, NOAA, the Marine Fisheries, has funded some of this work. Bycatch Reduction Consortium worked with these guys at New England Aquarium quite a bit, and also Anna McGregor, a former PhD student who built the original whale model. So I will stop there.
Well, look at that. It's 8 o'clock. Sorry, no questions, folks. No, seriously. First of all, a big hand for all these speakers. I think they were excellent presentations. If we can, if you have to leave, obviously I understand, except for you guys. But let's take a few questions and engage this really cross-disciplinary panel with industry and science on this question of whale entanglements and fishing gear. You got to get out of the dark spot. Yeah. Any questions? Yes, in the brown.
So I'm just wondering, with the stats on entanglement, but with maybe lobster gear not being entirely the source, what other kinds of gear are they entangling in? Is it, a combination of ghost nets or other kinds of things? What other things other than lobster gear are entangling?
Well, unfortunately, for most of the entanglement cases, especially the scarred-only animals, we don't know what gear is involved. But we do know that it's lobster gear, gill net gear, crab gear, snow crab, hagfish. So it's any fixed gear fishing that's out there is a potential problem.
Well, I want to, and to your question, it's a Narragansett, NOAA has a place in Narragansett, Rhode Island, where they store the disentangled gear. So as Amy mentioned, that's some of the gear. But it also goes to monofilament line from rods and reels. There was one section that looked like it was floating rope with little toggles on it that you might have in a beach area to keep the swimmers in from that area. So it's anything that's floating in the line. It's not just lobster gear or not just fishing gear, but it gets all melded together so that it's stated as fishing gear. I'm protecting my industry.
In the red here, or?
You forgot it.
I had a couple questions, I guess.
Oh wait, I just realized who it is.
When I was watching the slide of the whale get entangled, it kind of made me think of the mouth entanglements around the whale when it goes from the mouth to the baleen around the head. Now the whales feed, when they feed, I've seen them, it's, they're upright feeding on the surface. They feed on their side at all?
Yeah, absolutely they do. Particularly, they can do that sometimes at the surface or down near the bottom. And that is an important point. We need to include that, but we don't have that yet put into our...
How the mouth wraps happen if it moves up vertically up and down and a whale's feeding like this. You wouldn't think it'll get caught in the mouth that way. The whale would have to be feeding on its side.
Sorry, I was reminded I need to repeat the question.
Okay.
The question was, do whales feed as they're swimming along their side and as it relates to entanglement risk?
Right.
I can just speak a little bit about that. In Cape Cod Bay, where there's a lot of skim feeding at the surface, where you can actually witness how they're oriented, there is a lot of side feeding that we see. So I suspect at depth that happens too, and some of the tagging, detagging work has shown that.
Question.
The question has to do with the video clip that was shown at in the introductory part, asking whether or not why the whale didn't become entangled in some of those ropes. That particular clip was actually developed as part of a video game. So what we do know about right whales is that about what is it, Amy? 83% of them show scarring from becoming entangled, and so what we know is that there's more encounters with ropes than there are entanglements. So there are many instances in which they're breaking free from ropes, but we don't necessarily understand the extent to which. What the circumstances are under which they're able to avoid becoming seriously entangled versus when they end up becoming entangled. There's a question about whale vision and whether or not ropes can see the lines and if that helps them avoid them. Boy, I wonder if there's anybody in the audience who would know anything about this. I'll invite you to add to this. Oh, great.
I'll answer the question.
Great. So what we know about baleen whales is that they're monochromats. So essentially they are colorblind. but they do see contrast when different colors are in different backgrounds. So in other words, if you present something that's in a reddish, orange, or black spectrum against a blue, dark blue background, to them it's a very strong contrast, which makes sense. So the question has to do with, we've focused a lot this evening on some gear modifications. The question is much broader. What about just changing how we fish altogether? I'll invite Kristen and John to field that question.
Yeah, I can take. So the main fishery, probably similar to the Massachusetts fishery, is that we have gear that is in 6 feet of water, and we have gear that's in 600 feet of water, or deeper, and that's just there are lobsters in those areas. And yes, you could do seasons, but those seasons don't exactly wrap up with the same time that, if you had to do seasons for when whales were there, it's the same time lobsters are there, so it's pretty tricky that way. But we've done some things like, because somebody made me go through my presentation really fast, so I didn't get to say it. But in 2014, we went to what we call trawling up rules. So you can only have, I have 15 traps with a line on each end. So, before, you could fish singles. You could fish, every trap had a line going down to it. Whereas now, the farther you go off from shore, the more traps per line you have to have. So that decreases the amount of lines going from top to bottom. And the big thing is for Maine, a lot of Maine's fishery is exempt because it's areas that whales just don't go in because whales basically migrate from Massachusetts to Canada or Bay of Fundy or up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And we realize they don't take a plane. They come up by us, but mostly they go outside. Occasionally, there's a sighting inside, but for the most part, what we're really concerned with is a lot of the offshore waters.
John, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll try. I just want to make sure I get your question, because I don't think it was answered. You said to change the fishery, right?
Well, I mean,
To-
are there different ways to fish
Yeah,
the
no.
animal and or farming? Because I do know that juveniles are found inshore before they move offshore. And are those even viable to
Right.
raise at a certain point or not?
Right, and you probably see the juveniles on shore due to the tidal currents and the way the rotation is, and then where they settle. But let me try and answer your question about changing the industry. The answer is you can't change a lobsterman from going down to his boat at a certain time, never mind change the way they're going to actually do it. This is a monumental task, all right, to try and change the thought process of how to haul a lobster trap. If you do bollard pulls that Amy's been doing, there's commercial lobstermen that think that when they turn that hauler on, they're pulling, they got 10,000 pounds they're pulling, and they're thinking that they're going to need that, which they don't. And basically all they're doing is, until it breaks the surface, you're only putting anywhere from 800 pounds to 1,200 pounds of pull on that vertical line. But I don't think there's an easy answer to your question to change it and everything's going to be euphoric. I'm sorry.
No, I get that.
It's just the way it is.
$1 billion on the line.
Well, I'll take the $1 billion. So let.
You figured it out.
He's just an honest fisherman.
No such thing.
Honest but poor.
In the back. So if I heard you correctly, the question is about what sort of forces are generated by the whale on the ropes and what sort of resistance is encountered when the whale comes into conflict with the rope. Lars, you want to field that?
Yeah, we actually know that information fairly well from the simulations. When you have tension on opposite ends of the rope and you have some rope wrapping around the whale, then there's friction between that rope and the whale skin, so we can calculate that information. But there's also been some fairly good studies done by Becky Woodward, who at that time was at Woods Hole Institution, where she took some dolphin cadavers and actually put rope on them, instrumented that, and looked at the cutting force it would take to actually cut down into the tissue. So that is certainly something that people have studied and they're interested in.
Over here.
I'm curious about the low risk entanglement shed. I'm curious if any sort of additive effects from the number of entanglements they have. So, for example, some whales can
So the question has to do with long-term effects of entanglements, even those that are categorized as low risk.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one we are exploring. We've been working with a fellow who's also down at Duke, Rob Schick, who's been able to model the health on a monthly basis for each individual. And we're going to look at the health of those whales that have been entangled multiple times and see if there is a cumulative impact to their health. We do know, as I mentioned, the moderate and severe injuries are causing a health decline, especially in reproductive females. So we're going to continue that work.
We'll take a couple more over here.
So the take reduction plan as it is right now, it requires those weak links for surface connection, right?
Yeah.
And in one of the presentations, it was mentioned that Canada hasn't had a lot of the same regulations as us. Thus, they've had a lot more incidences. So in changing the process in the tape reduction plan and looking at line breaking strength, do you think, is it worthwhile? Is it that the weak links aren't as effective, or breaking one, different strength breaking line would be more effective in reducing these fatalities, or is it possibly that, other countries, Canada, they haven't had the same regulations as us, and incorporating them, you might see a decline just at that level alone?
So I'm hearing two parts to your question. One is, well, we already have these weak links under the U.S. large whale take reduction plan, and how effective are they? And is some of the whale release rope that Amy presented on really just a version of that? And also, if Canada were to implement, for example, this and some other measures, might we be able to make progress on this issue? Is that a fair?
I can take some. Go ahead.
Okay. So the weak link at the surface buoy is one of those modifications that we actually don't know how effective it's been, because if it does work, you're not going to see the whale carrying gear, because that rope's going to slide through and hit the concept is that the rope would slide till it hits the buoy and then it would part, so you don't have the buoy lodged in the baleen and keeping the gear attached. But we have seen entanglements where the weak link, the whale hits the rope further down, and so it's not, the gear isn't shifting through the mouth till it gets to the buoy. And so we're seeing weak links in some of these entanglements. So we know it's not effective 100% of the time. And I think it may be helping in a certain number of cases, but it's hard to quantify. We're still seeing an escalated number of whales carrying gear from both U.S. gear and Canadian gear.
I'll just add my 2 cents in on that, in that there is a warehouse of gear that's been taken off whales. And for the most part, the U.S. fisheries mark their gear. We put a tracer in our line. I wrap a red piece of twine in my line in three places, so that if that's found, they know what area it comes from and what fishery. So, and most of the gear, as Amy mentioned, is undetermined. So if people aren't marking, it's not on there. And who's not marking? Canada's not marking. So we can't at least get them to mark. If they marked, at least they marked, they could put your money where your mouth is and say it isn't us. But anything that isn't marked can't be attributed to anybody. So I think what happened last year in Canada is pushing them to do a little more. And I believe that if we all had individual marks and we could narrow that down better and more marks, so that we could, if I say it's not me, then I can prove that, because every time they take one off, it can be determined. So if all of us from Florida to Gulf of St. Lawrence can get on the same page on marking, so that we can better understand where this gear is coming from. Because I went down to the gear shop when we did a reverse engineering workshop, and took a bunch of fishermen and laid this gear out, so to have us look at it and say, okay, where did this gear come from? And we didn't know. And some of this was the oddest stuff that you wouldn't see in any of our fisheries. So, I mean, to mark gear and to mark buoys and everything so that we know where it comes from is very crucial, so that we're looking in the right places to solve the problem.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Canada's actually working on a more advanced rope marking scheme that they showed to some U.S. lobstermen, and they were not thrilled with it. Somebody's got to step up for Canada. In the back. The question is, it's really a statement about some surprise that only 78% of entanglements are considered minor. Amy?
Yep. So that data point is based on entanglements documented from 1980 through 2015. But as I showed in my graph, it's only in recent 10 or 15 years that we're seeing a greater proportion of the annual entanglements with moderate and severe injuries, and a greater number of entanglements with attached gear. So it's a more recent phenomenon, but that data point is for the entire time span.
Let's take two more over here in the red. Right.
I'm just curious about the process. Once a whale is so marked and so scarred that they're at high risk, what happens then? Does their immune system go down? Are they unable to eat? You made reference to the fact that they disappear or they die. So what does the scarring and entanglement do to their life expectancy?
So the question has to do with what scarring from ropes as well as entanglement events mean for the long-term health and survival, I guess, of the right whales. Amy, I think that one's for you again.
Well, we know from a few different studies. My colleague Roz Rolland here did a study on looking at the stress hormones in fecal samples of entangled whales. Their stress hormones were through the roof. And so we know that an entanglement event can cause a tremendous increase in stress. That's going to suppress whales' immune system. For those whales with deeply embedded gear or deep cuts, severe cuts, even if they don't have attached gear, they're probably more prone to infection. And we've been able to show that those severe injuries just cause a dramatic decline in survival for those whales. So sometimes it takes many years for them to die. As I showed you for that one whale we tried to disentangle. So it's a combination of factors that are going to be impacting those individuals with those nasty entanglements.
In the back? So does the classification of the severity of entanglement factor in what happens to the whale after it's become entangled? Amy?
So when we did the categorization of entanglement severity, we did that independently of the other work that was going on, looking at stress hormones or survival or all those things. And so the linkage is that for the minor entanglements, we're not seeing, the ones that result in minor injuries are not resulting in health declines for the whales, whereas the moderate and severe injuries, whether there's gear attached or not, we are seeing a decline in health. And we're probably seeing the elevated stress hormones as well. So it was sort of two ways of looking at the same problem, one from the severity angle and then another way from the stress hormone angle, and recognizing that the severity is a very important way to assess how a whale is going to fare in the long term. For those that are disentangled, we know that some have gone on to reproduce, so that's been successful. Others have been disentangled, like the one that Laura showed that was disentangled and then 6 weeks later it was found dead. So disentanglement can help if it's caught early enough in the entanglement event, but once it's become a long duration entanglement, it's not likely to be successful.
Okay, so I'll take last one because we're getting kind of late into the evening. That's
Actually backtracking to the marking the rope. When did that first begin, and have you seen like a decrease of marked rope entanglements because it's causing fishermen to have to take the blame for the entanglements?
So the question is, when did rope marking start, and has marking had an impact on fishermen in that their gear has a risk of being identified as being involved with an entanglement? Kristen and John, you guys?
I can address the gear. We've been marking, 2000? With what originally it was one red mark. For my mark is red in our area, on somewhere in the line. And then in some of the rope that's been taken off wheels, you may not get a long piece. So we decided to do more, at least 3 places, so you get more of a chance. And that took effect in 2014. And NOAA law enforcement did their kind of sweep of guys and found 90-some% compliance on a lot of the marking and in the whale rules. So yes, guys are doing it. Guys are marking. No, there's nobody that's not marking just because, well, if I don't want that whale to get caught and come back to me or come back to my fishery. So I think it's happening because the consequences of not doing it are greater than doing it.
Well, it's the same thing. And one point that wasn't raised in that is that we're saying that they're going to go from the Florida Straits to the Gulf of St. Lawrence is basically what the majority of the time which they do, but they also will go further to Greenland, Iceland, and even to the fact of going to Norway, from what I understand. So that's a large area, and when you're the only state or the only country that is marking, and the gear that you see or has been taken off is not any type of gear that's marked, you try to come to a conclusion that, I guess the bottom line is that they travel in such a large area that just by marking gear in the United States is not the end all, because as was stated earlier, there's always that undetermined because of it might be from a different origin of a country, or it may not have been enough line. Well,
I just want to say one more thing about entanglements is that we just have to remember that we're only seeing only a small portion of the whales that we know interact with gear actually show up with gear on them. It was like around 8% of all the interactions. And then only a small portion of that has been able to be traced back to where the gear was set. So it's important to remember that that's the tip of the iceberg of what we've been able to learn from the retrieved gear about where it's occurring and what kind of gear it's occurring in. So I think based on some evidence that has been provided by NOAA, it's happening throughout their range, inshore, offshore, Canada, down to Florida. So there's no area that's particularly safe for right whales or large whales from fishing gear. So.
Thanks. I've found this very instructive, that interplay between engineering and marine mammalogists and fishermen is really a key theme in what we're all about here, trying to solve this problem. And I also learned that I need to invite a Canadian to the next one, because then it'll be really exciting. There'll be some knockdown slamming happening here. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I think some of our panelists might stick around in the lobby if any of you want to have a few parting questions or shots for a little while. So yeah. So please stick around, and thanks again, everyone.